Well, good morning, everybody out there. It is on the hour. We like to start on time. I like to say, unlike the flooring trade. And so with that said, welcome to this NFCA education webinar. A little bit about NFCA before we hand the mic over to André. NFCA has been around for 40 years. It's really repurposed itself in the last 6 or 7 years to take advantage of the internet and put good messaging out there, create platforms for events like we're going to have this morning, where good people with experts in their field can come to a platform which is unbiased and just put that information out there for the construction industry to take advantage of. I ran into André about 6 or 7 years ago, saw his talk at that time, and having been in flooring for many years, thought, wow, this information is fantastic on a subject which has plagued and bothered us in the flooring industry for a long time, and that is, how do we solve high IICs, or sorry, sound transference using, 2 millimeter or 3 millimeter underlay products that claim to offer a good sound barrier. And as we know, it's the expectations are very high, and they just don't deliver. So this sort of thing, as you'll find out from Andre's content, is really something that is dealt with, should be dealt with at the architectural stage, and not allowed to fall back on the idea that maybe a 2 mil underlay is going to solve the problems experienced by stratas, homeowners, property managers, and everybody else involved. So it's great content. That's what I thought when I first saw André do his thing, and he does it in a way that's digestible and interesting. So do I have anything else to say? One thing a little bit more about NFCA is that we offer specification guides to get flooring installed properly for the architectural community and the construction managers out there. It's important to understand some of the challenges that flooring brings. It's often not really considered how challenging flooring can be until the floor installer shows up and, for example, rejects the site conditions or rejects the site, walks off the job, and then everything grinds to a halt. The only way to avoid that is to have conversations early in the construction process and use the right specification language. So if anybody has any questions about that, you can reach out to us. Our contacts page is on our website, www.nfca.ca. With that said, I'm excited to hand you over to André and FINITEC. Great content, so enjoy, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. Can you hear me well? Beautiful. So, first of all, I'm super excited to be here. Well, you know what I mean? I've been at home for 8 weeks now, so when I mean excited to be here, I'm meaning with you all. Couple thank yous before I start. NFCA, thank you so much, Chris and Lee, putting this thing together. Thank you for the opportunity for AcoustiTECH to be speaking. There's a great turnout this morning. We're going to be flirting with 150 people on the call today, so that's amazing. So it shows that there's a level of interest in the topic, which is amazing. So we'll try to share as much as we possibly can on that topic. Also want to thank my colleagues at AcoustiTECH that obviously scheduled and worked on the webinars. Also want to thank particularly Frederick and Christian that helped me join the 21st century. When it comes to technology, trust me when I tell you, there was a lot of trial and errors because again, this is a first for me on the webinar side of things. But hey, now that we got it down, we'll be ready to roll for the next ones. Also want to thank all of you for attending. Obviously, you guys have very, very few choices of webinars to attend. No, joke aside, we appreciate you taking your time out of your day to attend this one. And also, it gives me an opportunity to wear a shirt for the first time in 2 months. So thank you so much. It feels great. A couple of household items. And Chris, by the way, would you do me a favor, bud? Can you turn off your camera if you can? I do know the PowerPoint quite by heart, but not that by heart. Thank you, Chris. So ultimately, a couple of household things. First, I'm going to play a few videos for you this morning or this afternoon, depending where you're at. So please stay close to your volume buttons, because some of the sounds are a little bit louder than others. So I wouldn't want anybody to jump off their chair or something. So just try to stay close to your volume button. Also, for those of you that at some point, if something comes up and you can't make it till the end, there's no issue there. Since you've signed up, you can get the recording after the fact, and then you can rewatch it. Chris, as I said a little bit earlier, you can jump in at any time. We truly value your opinion for you and your group. And also want to take advantage of the opportunity to wish Happy Mother's Day in advance to all the mothers out there. So let's get started. We'll try to make this as painless as possible. For those of you that do not know who AcoustiTECH is, we're a company, head office based out of Quebec. We've been doing business for close to, well, actually 20 years now. We, in a nutshell, what we do is we offer guidance and solutions for architects, developers, flooring contractors, flooring manufacturers, general contractors, engineers that are possibly frustrated with a few things. So in our experience over the years, we've come across a lot of frustration in this field, and we've basically made it our mission to try to help out. So the possibility of acoustic complaints or lawsuits, which is quite common also with property management companies. I know a few of them are on the call now, so thank you. Condo boards. So ultimately, the possibility or the fact that there are complaints and lawsuits within your building. Customers' negative perception of the building. So I also work personally, so does my team, with a lot of builders that ultimately are competing against concrete buildings, an example, and they're doing light wood frame buildings, and sadly, the acoustics and sound insulation within those buildings is not where it should be. So we to some extent collaborate and contribute and assist people in trying to find solutions for that. Also new code regulations, whether you're in the US, whether you are in Canada, ultimately the code can be a little bit different. Sometimes the code can basically dictate where we need to be on the acoustics. Sometimes it's even the weight. So as an example, BC just introduced a new provision in the code for weight. So obviously the code is telling you what you can and can't do, but there's obviously impact on the acoustic side of things. So we also do a lot of assistance on that front too. And last but not least, abundance of products and unclear information. So lots of information out there, mind you. That's precisely why with the NFCA, that's precisely why the NFCA has an interest in putting this kind of information in front of you all. So enough about us. Let's get going with the agenda for today. So I want to talk to you guys very quickly about acoustic principles. Some of you may have attended the light wood frame insulation webinar last week. My colleague Christian out of Toronto did that, which he did an amazing job. So thank you, Christian, on that. So I didn't want this to make it too redundant, and besides, I also want to make it more relevant to flooring. So that's the idea. That's why we're here this morning. So we're going to try to talk about the principles that are mainly about flooring. I want to talk about structure types. It's extremely important to go through them. Also want to talk to you about underlayment. I want to talk to you about floor coverings. Basically what we've seen, what we've basically figured out over the years. I want to talk to you a little bit about assemblies. It's certainly not going to be the biggest part within the day, but it doesn't change the fact that assemblies, I think, are important to see a little bit what's out there. And then we'll go to recap and takeaways and question and answers. Question and answers, I can tell you right now, obviously, you guys can just raise your hand and ask me a question, so we'll see how that goes. I want to say it now, that ultimately, if you do have questions and ultimately you're not necessarily familiar with like sending it by email, or at least on the platform, rest assured that any question that gets our way or my way will be answered in a timely fashion. So let's get started again. So let's talk about acoustic principles. I want you guys to be a little bit more familiar about how acoustic works and what's out there. What's the code saying? What are people expecting? So that's kind of why I want to get into this. The STC requirements. So STC stands for Sound Transmission Class, and it measures basically the airborne sound. Airborne sound being music, television, radio, people screaming, singing, shouting, whatever it may be. If you look at the graph, basically you'll notice that airborne sounds travel in all directions. So it's very important to understand that if we are running into an issue or if we want to avoid an issue, well, we need to understand basically what we're up against. So because the IIC, which we'll talk about mainly within this webinar, has nothing to do with the STC to some extent. They're completely different animals and they're controlled completely differently too. So the airborne sounds travel in all directions, meaning you can have a sound that originates from a unit below, that's going to travel up to the unit above, or you can have side to side. For your information, minimum STC required, that includes Canada and the US, is 50. We're going to get through the data a little bit more in a minute, but I want you to know that the STC required is 50. Obviously, if you're an architect or a developer, you're well aware, or an engineer, you're obviously well aware of that requirement because it is in the code, it's by a law. So you have to pay attention to the STC. Minimum ASTC required is 47. The A stands for apparent. So my goal here is not to make anybody an acoustic engineers. As a matter of fact, there's probably acoustic engineers on the call. So hopefully I don't get in trouble. Ultimately, we're trying to keep it simple. Apparent sound transmission class, the A basically is more of like the new field testing. So it takes into consideration flanking and the fact that when you're not in a laboratory, that it's most likely not going to perform like you would be in a controlled environment. Recommended minimum STC in Canada is 55. So the recommendation in Canada is 55, but the requirement is 50. Now let's get to the core, because once again, this is definitely related to flooring. Let's get to the core on the IIC side. So impact installation class measures the transfer of the impact noise. Impact noise can be walking, running, playing with a toy on the floor, dropping objects, moving furniture, anything in contact with your structure will be considered an impact noise. Which again, it doesn't work the same with an FTC whatsoever because FTC does not require any kind of bridging. It doesn't require to be in contact between two masts or two components. So a few things here. Minimum IIC required in Canada is not applicable. So in Canada, you do not have legally a responsibility to do anything on the IIC. In the US, it's also 50. So to some extent, you have to be at IIC 50 in order for to be basically to some extent legal. The recommended minimum IIC in Canada, although there's no requirement, is 55. Okay. The expected from our point of view, what we've experienced over the past 20 years, expected IIC is often over 55. So people, to some extent, when I say people, I'm talking about occupants, condo owners, renters, hotel room attendants to some extent. So ultimately, people expect to be to some extent over that recommendation. That's most likely why the code to some extent suggests to be over 55, although you don't have to. Here's the kicker. In real life, despite the high IICs we see out there, and we'll get through this in a second, despite the fact that expected IIC is over 55, in real life, often we end up seeing that the building is performing at 45 to 54. For sure, there's going to be times where all of a sudden things going to be, there's going to be like things, people have paid attention, they've done the right thing, and then the building is over 55, no doubt about that. But more often than not, people think that they are well over 55. As a matter of fact, they think they're at 72 or 78, and then we'll talk about that in a minute. But in reality, when you're doing a test, you end up showing something that's well under the 55 range. Another thing I want to basically ask you, and I know you can't answer me, is the percentage of complaints. The percentage of complaints between the STC and the IIC is definitely well over the 80% range. What that means is 80% of complaints that, in a condo or apartment buildings, whatever it may be, will come from the IIC. The irony of that is the IIC is, at least in Canada, not required by code. So let me ask you this. Do you think Mr. and Mrs. Smith that end up buying or think of buying a condo unit know what the code says when it comes to the IIC? Absolutely not. They have no idea what the code says. And even worse than that, they don't care. They truly do not care whether the code says anything or not. So what happens is, and we're a company that deal with the aftermath of that a lot. Ultimately, what happens is somebody moves in, people think they're in good shape, there's a complaint, there's a test being done, and the rating shows up to be not where the expectation was, or what the builder or the property management company or condo board was expecting either. So ultimately, we end up with even more frustration. So now, and then I'll explain to some extent what the IIC and how that works. Why high IICs? And who's asking for that? And why are they asking for that? High IICs, as far as I'm concerned, there's obviously more reasons than that. But to some extent, in my opinion, the reason that we see high IICs out there, and by the way, in some territories we see it, in some territories we don't. In high IICs, the reason we see that is because people are willing to throw out high IICs associated with their products. So ultimately what happens is, just use an example, a condo board is asking for 65 or 72, and all of a sudden they're still running into issues. So somebody else is publicizing or publishing a 74, but they're still running into issue while we're going to increase the requirement in our building because it's obviously not working. So the problem with that is it keeps going up and up and up. So all of a sudden we're all stuck in this beautiful industry, that's the flooring industry, dealing with requirements or expectations that are completely not realistic. And it's a vicious circle that keeps happening and happening. So I don't know, Chris, if you want to add anything to this, be my guest. But from our experience, one of the reasons we want to put this webinar together is exactly that, is to try to stop the bleeding and find a way to all come together and change the way that ultimately we're going to do things. And I truly believe, and my company truly believes, that we're going to change to some extent, that we're going to just better, the well-being of the occupants, whether it's in a hotel room, a suite, or a condo, or whatever it may be. So an IIC rating, so just so we understand how it actually works, there's a tapping machine on top of a floor, and there's a receiving machine in the unit below. That tapping machine makes a rec. It's super loud, creates obviously a vibration. Microphone in the unit below is actually capturing what's actually going through. So let me ask this. What are we actually testing when we're doing an IIC test? Well, I'll tell you what we're not testing. We're not testing a floor. So when people say to you, those of you that are flooring manufacturers out there, flooring contractors, what is the acoustic rating of your floor? That's the wrong question to ask. Are we testing an underlayment? We're not testing an underlayment on its own. We're not testing a layer of drywall. We're not testing a concrete slab. We are testing every single component that you're going to see between the tapping machine and the receiving machine. So the question that we should ask ourselves, that people should ask us and keep us accountable in the flooring industry, is why is it that you're associating a rating to your underlay or to your floor or to your whatever component you'll find in the ceiling? So this is also one of the issues that we see out there, is there's no such thing as a rating associated to a product, because if I wanted to, I could take this piece of paper and I could literally make it say whatever I want. It only depends on how I'm testing it and with what. So to illustrate that, I'll show you a little bit what we're dealing with. So for example, out there we see AIIC 72 plus, sometimes 80, sometimes 65, whatever it may be. But ultimately, the concrete slab will have a performance on its own, and they're not always shooting the same rating in all applications. The underlay is another component to take into account, and the floor. So in this case, we have three components that all contribute to basically what the rating is going to be. The problem with that rating is ultimately, can we really achieve a AIIC 72 with hard surface flooring on a concrete slab as is? Absolutely not, because a concrete slab on its own can, to some extent, average shoot anywhere between 28 IIC on its own to 30 to 36. The average would probably be around the 30-32 range. So of course you can find 26 AIIC on the slab alone, nothing underneath, nothing on top, and then sometimes you'll see the odd slab that's going to be 36. So the performance of the slab needs to be taken into consideration on what's the floor also. We also see people publicizing IICs versus, AIICs. So ultimately, we need to kind of look at the fine prints. So IIC versus AIIC is like comparing gas consumption in a car between a highway driver and basically somebody driving in the city. That number is not the same because there's more stop and go in the city than there is on a highway. So we kind of need to some extent, compare apples to apples. And also, guys, we are always going to be testing a floor ceiling assembly. A rating cannot be associated to a product. So if I take this underlay, if I use it in a concrete slab, it's going to have a rating associated with it as far as the assembly is concerned. But if I take this and I use it in a completely different environment, I'm going to be completely somewhere else. So this is extremely important and in the middle of a lot of misperception, a lot of misunderstanding how this world actually works. So is it plausible that an actual underlay with a hardwood or laminate or ceramic, whatever it may be, on a slab will in reality shoot 54? I can tell you that it could shoot 47, and I can tell you it could shoot 62, depending on what the components are. Extremely important to associate a rating to an assembly, not to a product. I want to touch on Delta for a minute. Delta is technically supposed to isolate the performance of a product. The challenge with Delta is, the Delta, just so everyone is on the same page and understand what I'm referring to. The Delta, for example, if we want to try to identify the Delta, the underlay that's actually on underneath the floor over top the slab. Yes, if you test the floor directly over top the slab, you're going to get a rating. Let's assume that that rating is 40. All of a sudden, you introduce an underlay and it shoots 60. You can associate the Delta in that particular occasion that the Delta was 20. That's great. The problem with that is, if you take that same underlay that claims a Delta of 20 and you apply it to a wood frame structure or to a slab that's not as efficient, there's no way in the world that we can predict nor guarantee that the difference between using the underlay and not using it will claim a 20 improvement. So a Delta is great because it does isolate the performance of a material, fair enough. But the bottom line is you can never get it outside of context. So we always to some extent need to understand what's the assembly. There's no way around it. So once again, I invite everyone to always be cautious with the concept of the Delta. There's nothing wrong with it. It just needs to be put in perspective. By the way, just so we understand each other, I am not suggesting that underlayments, flooring, whatever components are not achieving the ratings that they're claiming. I want to make this clear. All I am saying is the question that we should ask ourselves is the how. So if I say to people out there right now that I golfed 78 last weekend, I wish. If I golfed 78 last week, and ultimately I talked to one of you or I golf with one of you in a couple months, and ultimately I shoot 130, people are going to say, what's wrong? What's happened? Well, ultimately, I may have got cut by the rain and I only played 11 holes. So for those of you that are familiar with golf, there's 18 holes in a round of golf. So I am not lying that I shot the ball 78 times. I'm just not telling you how many holes I've played. So if we get a little bit more agile in asking the questions, we're going to avoid a lot of issues in the long run. Okay. Now, some of you may be like wondering what's the difference between different ratings. So, you know, if I'm to be investing in a 60, what does that do versus a 50? So obviously extremely difficult to answer, but I'm going to try to some extent to make you hear the difference between a 50, which is to some extent a minimum in the US, 55, which is a recommendation in Canada, and 60, which to some extent could be in some cases the expectation. So this is a moment of truth. Let's try to see if I can play this. Sorry guys, give me a second. It worked every single time, of course. Okay. By the way, I create myself a card called "Get Out of Awkwardness for Free" card. So I'm allowed. So I'm going to try this again, see if I can do it. Sorry guys. Bear with me. Yeah, no, for some reason that one doesn't want to play. So it happens, technology. So guys, I'm gonna have a couple more to play. If ever somebody wants to hear this after the webinar, please reach out to me. I'll send you the landing page to all the sounds that I'm technically supposed to be playing today for you. But one of the things I do want to say, so at some point, if you get a chance to get that landing page and test it out, what I want to tell you is the 50 and 60, the difference between the 10 dB here means that that building or that 60 would be twice as quiet as the one that shoots 50. So I've personally dealt with builders that were sitting in the high 40s acoustically, and now they're shooting 60. And ultimately, the difference would be their building is twice as quiet. So every time we get like 5 points, every time we get 10 points, and it's not always that hard. It's using the right things at the right place that make a difference. You'd be shocked as far as what improvement we can get. Okay. I want to talk to you guys about principles briefly. So 5 of them, I'm going to focus on a couple. So the presence of mass in a building, the presence of resilience and decoupling, which is huge in the flooring industry, void treatment, sealing and flanking. Void treatment, just so you know, is all about bad insulation in the ceiling. So how important it is to slow down the STC. As far as sealing, which is basically wherever air can pass, so can sound. So be very careful with like air vents and things like that, or space under the doors. So these are very important, not as much related to flooring. So that's why I'm going to focus on the first few. So mass. Mass does 2 things in a building. It helps greatly with the STC. As a matter of fact, that's what it's for. So more mass you've got, better off you're going to be on the STC, sound transmission class. So voices, my doors are shut right now because ultimately I don't want the sound to come in this room. So more you introduce density and mass between your ears and the voice of somebody else, better off you're going to be. That's why a concrete structure is always super efficient on an STC. The second thing is flanking. Heavier something is, heavier a structure is, better off you're going to be when it comes to flanking, meaning the vibration is not going to some extent, vibrate as much within the whole building. So it helps a lot on that front. So you always need some mass within your structure. Resilience and decoupling. Resilience and decoupling is by far the most neglected principle in the acoustic industry on a new and existing building. So in a nutshell, resilience and decoupling means is make things not touch each other. So unlike the STC, the IIC loves to go from dense material to dense material. So if you use a hard surface floor versus carpet, you're introducing something that's super hard that you're going to basically put over top a hard substrate. Sometimes there's no underlay, sometimes there's one, and that underlay may even be hard. So you end up with different components on top of each other. And the IIC is like electricity. It's like thermal. It needs a bridge. It needs a physical conductor in order to transfer from one thing to another. So when we think about this, ultimately, if we would find a way to basically levitate a floor covering, whatever it is, over top whatever the substrate is, that vibration would not naturally jump from one component to another. So what we're trying to do is, if we would apply the principle of resilience and decoupling as many times as we can, sometimes we only have one shot at it, we would be in an amazing, amazing place. But often that's not what happens. We end up with hard floor, over top hard substrate or hard underlay, over top a hard basically concrete slab or wood frame structure, and the vibration finds its way down to the unit below. So that's what you're kind of seeing here on the graph. Even, for example, on a wood frame structure, this is single home on the left side. Obviously, the energy is going to go somewhere. The one in the middle is if you introduce gypcrete or concrete topping, fair enough. It's going to help for STC, and it's going to help for flanking a little bit. But on the resilience and decoupling, it's not sufficient on its own. On the third one, you can see what happens when you introduce a chuck. You introduce something that's going to reduce the transfer of that vibration between hard components. And you can, with that principle, do incredible, incredible things.
Andre, can I ask a question?
Please. Yes, sir.
This is an opportunity for the floor coverers out there, the salespeople, the A&D reps, everybody who has flooring interest in this, understand it's an opportunity to underline the difference between glue down flooring versus floating floors. It's constantly, which one's better for sound transference? And this is what you're kind of talking about here. Maybe
that's a very good question.
Yeah.
I will touch on that in the next few slides when I talk about different floor coverings. I'll certainly touch on that, Chris. I appreciate you asking the question. Okay. Chris, I might try to shut your. Okay. So now, other principle I want to show you is flanking. Flanking is in a nutshell, kind of the same idea, is to try to avoid products to touch each other and create a bridge. In the flooring industry, it's huge. So I want you to look at that graph. Is we can work with architects, we can work with condo boards and property management companies all we want. But ultimately, if the flooring is touching the baseboard and touching the wall, we're creating a leak. We're creating We're creating a bridge for the vibration. To some people are walking here, and all of a sudden, that vibration is going to bridge to something else, and then ultimately we're going to end up in trouble. So it's not only for expansion joints that it's extremely important to make sure the floor covering is not, or even the additional substrate, if there's one, to not touch the walls, because you're creating that bridge, and that's what we're trying to avoid in a nutshell. Okay. I'm going to give this another try. I want you to experience what decoupling really means, a vibration that all of a sudden we're bridging, how it can amplify sound. So I'm giving this a second try. Let's see. There we go, this one. So, as we can see, or as we can hear, the only difference on the music box between playing in the air and playing on the wall is ultimately creating a bridge, and all of a sudden that bridge creates more flanking, and that flanking gets amplified. So I want you all to imagine when we're doing floor ceiling assemblies or flooring insulation, how important it is to actually not create that, okay? Let's get the structure types for a bit, and we're going to get to the actual flooring. We'll share as much as we can. It's extremely important, guys, to understand that each structures that we're going to be dealing with has a different identity. They perform differently on their own. So when we are showing up as flooring contractors, flooring manufacturers, flooring industry as a whole, very important to understand that we're coming in with something that's already there. We're coming in with, we need to adjust our approach to the structure that we're working on, because as a whole, they don't have the same low frequency performance, they don't have the same high frequency performance. As an example, this is a floor, so ultimately low frequency, you may not hear it, but high frequency. So understanding if one building is going to be more prone to low frequency or high frequency is huge. because all of a sudden we're going to use the treatment that's going to be the best suited for that particular application. So honestly, I don't believe, nor does my company believe, that there's one product that does it all. There's no way that one underlay can do as good of a job in every single structure with every single assemblies out there. Because ultimately the building and the structure and how it's going to perform on STC, IIC, low and high frequencies, if you learn to navigate through this a little bit and get some guidance to do that, we can do incredible things. And honestly, guys, sometimes it's not even more expensive. It's just a matter of using the right thing. Okay. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly here as time is moving on. So very quickly to understand, I kind of touched on this a little bit before. A concrete structure, obviously extremely efficient when it comes to the STC because of the mass and the density. So for those of you not familiar with this, an 8-inch slab on its own with nothing underneath, nothing on top, will be well over the 55 recommended STC. So there's not really anything else that people need to pay attention to. Different thicknesses, different framing levels will influence the performance overall. But I think the key to this is this. When you are working in a condo or an apartment building, whatever it may be, and you are working on a concrete structure, extremely important to understand that we have one shot at doing it right on the decoupling. You have a floor, you have an underlay when there's one, and you have a slab. One shot. There's usually no ceiling. So ultimately, why not do the best job that we can underneath that floor over top that slab? That's obviously, that's what we're trying to do. I'm not suggesting everybody needs to shoot for the stars. That's not what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting sometimes to question what we're actually going to use in that particular case. Other thing with high frequency and low frequency on concrete slab. Concrete slab is so heavy that it performs very, very well on the low frequency, but it's lacking on performance on the high frequency and the high heels. So it's irrelevant or not as good of an idea to use an underlay, for example, that's going to perform better on low frequency if you're already covered within that curve, within that, to some extent, the acoustic report you get. So may as well try to compensate for what we're lacking on the high frequency. So there are technologies out there that perform better over top concrete slab because of the nature of the underlay. And ultimately, they're not necessarily more expensive. But ironically, when you end up on a light wood frame building, it may be completely opposite because you are lighter on a light wood frame building. So ultimately, you may need to compensate and use something that may be a little bit heavier. Okay, guys, very simple, all about the right product at the right place. Okay, so I'm going to say that multiple times. Steel structure extremely quickly, very similar to concrete. So it's a steel deck, and there's usually a concrete slab on top of it, 4 inches as an example. Very prone to flanking because there's metal involved. Sealing is extremely important. Obviously, you're pretty good on STC. Also, one shot at doing it right on the decoupling. Light wood frame, completely different animal. Light wood frame are more porous. They're lighter by nature. Usually, why people add a concrete topping or gypcrete is to basically help with the STC. So by adding mass, as we saw a little bit earlier, you're compensating for the lack of mass you have in the building in the first place. So you're in a better place on the flanking and on the STC. Once again, extremely important to understand that the light wood frame building is going to be prone to vibration more because it's lighter. Also, using the right product at the right place. As an example, we have different things out there that we can promote or talk about. It's never the same if you're concrete than light wood frame. Why is that? Because one underlay can be really much better than something else on a concrete, but the other way around when you're working on light wood frame for the reason I said a little bit earlier. Okay, mass timber, you guys are going to start seeing this. Mass timber is an amazing structure. It's gaining a lot in popularity, but it also has its challenges, especially acoustically. Usually people want to see the exposed mass timber or CLT or MPP or NLT. So you'll sometimes people will want to see the ceiling underneath. So the wood slab. The challenge with that is the slab on its own is not as efficient as the same thickness made of concrete, and we're not adding a ceiling. So we can only sound insulate that structure from the top. So that's even more important to do a really good job on top, not to end up in the numbers we talked about before, well below the either expectations recommendations or requirements. Okay. Let's talk about underlayment, which is the core of this all. I'm not here to talk up or down anything because that's not even how that works anyways. So I'm just going to touch on that briefly. There's technologies available out there, cork as an example, rubber, textile, foam. There's a huge variety of systems out there. It is all about using the right product at the right place. I think I've touched on that enough. Mind you, I could give you a quick example that if you're asking someone what's the best car you can drive, well, if you're pulling a boat or a trailer, it might be a pickup truck. And if you're a student going to school downtown, Vancouver, New York, San Francisco, wherever it may be, well, a pickup truck is definitely not the right vehicle for you. So what's the key to this? It depends what you're doing with it. So the right product at the right place goes a long ways, and to make sure that we're capable of seeing relevant data, it linked with your particular building. So if you are working on a concrete building, make sure the data is relevant to the actual assembly that you're dealing with. There's also, for you flooring contractors, flooring manufacturers out there, there's going to be new substrates. So be aware of new ways to do things, particularly on mass timber and on lightwood frame buildings, where all of a sudden there's going to be no concrete or gypcrete. There's going to be, whether it's mass timber or lightwood frame. So the compatibility between the flooring and the actual new substrate is going to be key. We're already in touch with multiple people on making sure that no one's going to be kind of surprised at what's going on that front. Other factors to consider: mechanical stability, thickness, vapor barrier, longevity, warranty. So I'll leave it up to you to basically do your homework on that front. Underlayment versus STC. Let's break a myth pretty quick here. An STC, we already point out the fact that you should not, or we should not, ask to some extent for a IIC for an underlayment where we're doing a renovation job. At least we should try to find data or relevant data that is reasonable within the building that you're at. So we should be cautious with that. But I can tell you that's even worse when I see a spec for an underlayment that needs to provide our STC rating. Let's make this simple. There's no such thing as an underlayment that's going to really change anything on the STC with any assembly, because STC is all about the density. It's all about the weight. So the mass. So you understand a 2 mil foam or 2 mil rubber or 2 mil whatever is not going to change the game on the STC whatsoever. So we probably shouldn't ask for ratings that way, but that's even more true with the STC. So the structure is really what's going to give you a performance or an efficiency or a rating on the STC front. Acoustic adhesives versus, you know, I hear a lot about acoustic adhesives. I just want to talk about this for literally 35 seconds. Acoustic adhesives, any acoustic adhesive or any adhesives will be acoustic by definition, because technically it's softer than the substrate, or it's harder than the floor. But the fact is, can you or can we claim or assume that gluing down our engineered hardwood directly over top of concrete slab will give you the same decoupling as using an underlay or using any underlay? Absolutely not. Is it plausible that it's going to happen? That you're going to see one data because you had a really efficient slab with a very efficient floor? Absolutely. I'm not denying the fact that it's plausible. But at the end, if we see it once every 10 times that there's a test, once again, I would suggest we read on the fine prints. As an example, AcoustiTECH, we have adhesives, but we never associate acoustic ratings to them, because ultimately we wouldn't want people to think that by doing a single glue down, they'll end up in the same place, and by doing a decoupling, double glue down. So that's just an example, and it's a personal opinion. If you don't agree, we can have a conversation after the fact. I'd be okay with that. I'm going to go to floor covering, and it's going to be almost basically the end, so it's 11:44. So I want to go quickly on the different floor coverings, what we found out, what we've seen. Carpet, no one's going to learn anything new here. It's best for IIC because of resilience. So it's obviously more resilience. It's obviously softer, so it's going to perform more on IIC. One thing that I want to point out is usually if you're comparing the same assembly with carpet versus hard surface floor, you can't match the performance on IIC of carpet with hard surface floor unless you would create a really, really big build-up over top of the subfloor is. I'm talking in renovation. So property management companies or condo boards, let's be cautious with it's impossible. You can't have the same performance of a hard surface floor than you do with a carpet. Second thing, carpet is great for IIC, but if, for example, there's no mass anywhere, it's not going to add anything on the STC. So you're not going to solve your problem on the STC by using carpet. It's going to be great for IIC, but not necessarily for the STC. Engineered hardwood, laminate, I'll kind of put them together. Floated or glued on the engineered hardwood, very easy to decouple. Double glue down can perform extremely well. Floated, obviously engineered, can perform extremely well. The mechanical stability, because they're usually thicker floors, is usually not problematic, actually super easy and smooth. Again, need the right underlayment. Needs the right underlayment depending on what you're trying to do. And Chris, I will get to your question right away. So the laminate floor, you have no choice but to use an underlay when you're doing a laminate floor. So if you're doing a basement, you need an underlay anyways, but it is not the same situation. And if you're doing a condo building or if you're doing a retrofit on a 6-story. So even though you must use an underlay, sometimes choosing the right underlay is going to go a long ways. You are correct, Chris, to some extent. If you're comparing a double glue down engineer versus a laminate, in theory, you would think that the floated application will be a little bit more efficient than a glued down one because there's more air between the components. On the other hand, I've multiple times seen a laminate floor over top an underlay, and all of a sudden the engineered double glue down with the right underlay outperformed the floated application. So once again, there's no direct path. We can't draw conclusions out of the gate. There's a lot of different range of performance within the flooring itself and also the underlay. So there's ways to do great jobs for both, and there's ways for one to be more efficient than the other at any given point. Again, one quick point on the laminate. An acoustical membrane is by definition an underlay. An underlay is not by definition an acoustical membrane. So we got to be a little careful with, to some extent, what it's actually designed to do. Vinyl planks, super trendy, very popular, can also be floated or glued depending on the SKU. Scratch and water resistant. So there's obviously a lot of advantages to it to some extent. Our experience with it, it's a very dense floor. So it's certainly transfer noise, it can transfer noise quite drastically because of its density. There's still a way to do a really good job on the acoustics with it. Sometimes there's a backing, sometimes there's not. I think the biggest challenge is a combination between acoustics and mechanical stability. What I mean by that is softer something is, to some extent, just to keep it simple, better off you're going to be on the IIC transfer. The problem with that is softer the underlay is, then more mechanical stability issues you may run into. So sometimes that's why, for example, for us, we ask for a certain thickness of the floor. So people have choices to make. What's more important to you? The acoustic performance of the assembly, or to some extent, everything else that the vinyl floor is going to bring. So ultimately, I've seen jobs where they added another underlay underneath the cork or foam backed LVT, and I've seen times where people glue directly down to the concrete. Bear with me here for 1 second. I want to move this. Ceramic tile, obviously extremely hard. The one thing I'll say about it is, because it's so dense, it's by far the most problematic flooring type for IIC, because it's going to conduct sound like no tomorrow. So same assembly, ceramic tile versus anything else. Ceramic tile will never match the efficiency of anything else because it's harder. By 4, 5, 6 IIC often we're going to see. So that's why very rarely on concrete slab, just to use as an example, will you see any performance over 55 with ceramic tile. And 55 is actually amazing with ceramic tile, where you can, to some extent, achieve that fairly easily with any other floor covering to some extent. Okay. Chris, did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. It's interesting because this was probably 15 years ago where I was involved in a high-rise multi-family setting, and I was quite convinced that the glue down, double glue down to a 6mm rubber was going to give us a better IIC transference to suites down below. And we proved through a tapping block test an engineer was brought in. We proved that actually the floating floor method was going to be better in that circumstance. So it's interesting that you underline the fact that it can be either way. It's all about the substrate and the ceiling, and all these components play a very important role, which is, I think, what is so important about your message. It goes beyond the floor covering system, and that's an important takeaway here.
It's huge, Chris. At the end, if you and I once again go golfing, there's one course, because it's, for example, narrower and you're better on the short game, you might absolutely kick my butt. And ultimately, if we go somewhere else where, you know, to some extent the long game is a little bit better, maybe I'm going to kick your butt. So ultimately, the bottom line is it's all about the conditions in which you're working. So you're correct. So very difficult to draw any conclusion, not to make it more complicated, but you're correct. We gotta be careful with that for sure. Okay. So quickly, it's 11:50. See, we have most people. So I promise you, I'll breeze through this in the next couple of minutes. I want to make you hear two things. There's a myth out there that says bare concrete slab is amazing for sound. Yeah, it's great for low frequency. It's great for STC. But when it gets to the high frequency, basically you'll see the difference. So what I would like you guys to do is turn your sound down a little bit at home, because that one is a little loud for sure, okay? Bear with me here. Go. So the point of this is basically to show you there's nothing bad about LVT. There's nothing wrong with it. Bottom line is, if you, for example, want to know what an LVT sounds like directly over top concrete, there was barely any difference between the two sounds. All of a sudden, you introduce a decoupler between them, and that vibration's got nowhere to go. So I thought it'd be interesting to kind of make you hear this. And those are real recordings. Okay. Assemblies, I'm breezing through this like no tomorrow. Just want to show you a little bit sometimes what it looks like. So what we're what options or what ratings can be achievable. Concrete slab, typical wood frame, we can do incredible things. All of a sudden with the IIC, some people think that it's impossible to perform better than concrete or light wood frame building. Well, I've got news for you. It's possible to do it by playing with the components and applying the right principles. Same thing also with systems that will completely get rid of the gypcrete concrete topping. There are ways to do that. So again, things to explore. We're going to start seeing some new ways. It's already happening. Same thing with mass timber. Mass timber has a lot of different options out there with and without concrete topping. So if ever you're working on anything, steel structure. It's 11:52, so I'll leave you with a couple things, and then if Chris, you want to some extent have the last word, we'll go from there. So a couple things. Acoustic, as we saw, it requires specific attention. It's important. IIC ratings, always of an assembly. If we follow the principles and understand them, we can really avoid issues, or to some extent even avoid issues for sure, or even solve problems. Read the fine prints. Let's try to be a little bit more on the red flags, or how is this tested with what. The right product at the right place, cannot stress that enough. Better acoustics, guys, we see it every day. Acoustics has become a major concern. You guys know this. For architects, developers, obviously condo boards, property management companies. So we're all dealing with this, whether we want it or not. So having a little bit more knowledge about it, understanding a little bit more what to ask and what to look into or look for is going to go a long ways. And I want to leave you with some thoughts. What are the requirements versus the expectations? Again, the requirements in Canada, as an example, or even in the US, which are very low on the low 50, there's a difference between the two. People are expecting peace and comfort. That's what they're expecting. So do we only need two? We can, but do we only need to meet the requirements, or can to some extent add some added value to meet the expectations? Second, what is our responsibility in the flooring industry? To some extent, it's got to be our responsibility to some extent to change the game, and to some extent stop the spin and the the vicious circle that we're on. How do we truly contribute to a better environment for the occupants? So I'm leaving you with these thoughts on how we can do that. There's a ton of ways that we can do that. And I think one of them, Chris, you tell me if I'm wrong, was to basically try to understand first and foremost how this world works, how this animal works, and then ultimately we can decide corporately or individually what we're willing to do about it. Couple add-ons before I give the mic to Chris for the last word. Add-ons. If any of you are interested in seeing all bunch of different assemblies and possibilities on all kinds of structures, we have a bunch of different acoustical recipe books, whether it's for mass timber, steel, lightwood frame, concrete, or all of them. We also have a program called AcoustiTECH. That's not about putting our products first and foremost. It's ultimately to try to find out what the options are. Acoustic Condo, I know Chris has been aware of what this program is about. Acoustic Condo is, in a nutshell, designed for the property management companies and the condo boards to try to assist them and accompany them in making the right recommendations for their buildings. So it's customized, and we loop that in with the flooring manufacturers and flooring contractors locally. So there's a lot of power within that program to try to change the game. And obviously, if any of you have any questions, any concern with the past hour, anything you'd like to chat about, obviously, I'm more than happy to do so. If ever you are not in Western Canada, still reach out to me and I'll put you in touch with either Christian or my team out east. Wherever you are, we'll make sure that we answer your questions and go from there. So I will not, because it's 11:56, I won't go to Q&A because either way it's a little tricky. But again, email me or email us and then we'll be more than happy to assist you. Chris, last word.
Yes, well, thank you, Andre. Again, great stuff. As you can see, for those of you remaining on this webinar still here, the level of detail with just this subject is impressive, and it's difficult to get to grips with. I mean, if you're an architect or if you're a general contractor, unfortunately for you folks, construction kind of expects you to know everything about everything, and I just don't know how you folks do your job. It's really tough. So in order to just dial into a subject like this and get the facts, you need to talk to the experts, and this is how we support each other in construction and move together as a team to get the right job done at the end of a complex process. We're going to be putting more of this stuff out on our, you can get access to it on our website. I've given you the URL earlier, nfca.ca. There's an education tab, and for example, next on the 13th of May, I think that's a Wednesday, there is a seminar. It's going out at no cost. All you got to do is register and request your invite, and that's on the subject of understanding and preventing floor covering failure. Our mission is to get the specifications right. Specifications drive contracts and actions on site. If we have the wrong spec, it's not good for anybody involved. So at least minimum standards for floor coverings can be found in documents. And we remove that tendency to cut and paste old specs into current projects, which they just don't add up, because today's products are very different from what they were even 10 years ago. So with that said, Andre, I'd like to thank you very much. Fantastic information. And to everybody else out there, stay well, and we will talk to you on the next seminar. And
yes, stay safe. And for those of you still on the call, we're going to put in a couple other webinars coming out in the next couple of weeks. So if you're interested in one of which is on mass timber, the other one's going to be on dry topping, so options to some extent, or the new kind of innovative ways to do things that we've talked about. So if you're interested, you'll see, keep an eye out for that email to be sent out. And thank you again. Stay safe, everyone. Thanks again, Chris. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Andre. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.